There comes a moment in every person's life when the weight of old wounds becomes heavier than the story that created them. The child inside you still remembers the tone, the absence, the misunderstanding, the moment you felt unseen, and yet the adult you are becoming senses a truth that the inner child cannot fully grasp. Healing does not come from changing the past, but from transforming your relationship with it. To forgive your parents is not to excuse what happened. It is not to say it didn't matter. It is to finally understand that pain you received did not begin with you. It was passed down, shaped by fears your parents never healed, shaped by beliefs they never questioned, and shaped by emotional wounds they never learned to express. You inherited more than their DNA. You inherited their unfinished stories, and now it becomes your sacred task to decide whether those stories continue. Forgiveness begins when you stop waiting for an apology that may never come. It begins the moment you choose to take your power back from the moments that once controlled you. It begins when you see your parents not as giants who failed, but as human beings who struggled. Perhaps they loved you in the only language they knew, even if it was incomplete. Perhaps they were carrying burdens that left little room for softness. Perhaps they didn't realize the impact their words and silences carved into you. You don't heal by changing them. You heal by changing what their actions mean within you. Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is remembering with wisdom instead of pain. It is releasing the grip the past has on your nervous system. It is letting the child inside you finally rest. You are not responsible for the wounds that were handed to you, but you are responsible for not handing them forward. Let today be the moment you say, "It ends with me," not because they deserved forgiveness, but because you deserve peace. Forgiveness is not excusing the past, it is transforming your relationship with it. It is the slow and deliberate act of reclaiming your emotional territory from memories that once held power over you. When you forgive, you aren't rewriting what happened or pretending the hurt was small. You are simply choosing to stop reliving it in its original form. Pain has a way of looping in the mind, replaying the same scenes with the same intensity, as if time has no influence on emotional wounds. But transformation begins when you stop watching the memory from the eyes of the injured version of yourself and begin seeing it from the perspective of who you are now. The past event does not change, but its emotional charge does. Forgiveness asks you to understand the difference between responsibility and influence. You cannot go back and change who hurt you or how they acted, but you can decide how much space their actions continue to occupy within your inner world. When you stop excusing the past, you stop trying to justify it or make sense of why it happened. Instead, you shift the focus toward understanding what the experience shaped within you. Your fears, your beliefs, your emotional patterns. Once you see these clearly, the past becomes less about the person who caused the pain and more about the growth that emerged from it. You transform your relationship with the memory by no longer approaching it as a source of weakness, but as a point of awareness. In this transformation, there is a quiet reclamation of power. You no longer stand as the wounded child or the person who was betrayed, abandoned, or misunderstood. You stand as someone who has lived through something and now chooses how that experience fits into the story of your life. Forgiveness becomes an internal shift rather than an external expectation. It is not about waiting for someone to acknowledge the hurt. It is about acknowledging your own need for peace. When you transform your relationship with the past, you create emotional distance from the weight of old events. You stop carrying them as unfinished business. You stop letting them interrupt your current relationships with fear or defensiveness. You stop allowing them to dictate your worth. And slowly the past turns from a wound into a reference point, a reminder of how far you've come, instead of a reminder of how deeply you were hurt. This is the quiet power of forgiveness, the moment the past stops defining you and becomes something you have learned to rise above. Parents often act from their own unhealed wounds, carrying emotional injuries that were never spoken about, never understood, and never softened by support. When a parent reacts harshly, withdraws emotionally, or struggles to express love in a healthy way, it is often a reflection of their own history rather than a reflection of your worth. Many of the behaviors that felt personal to you were actually patterns they learned long before you were born. Their fears, insecurities, and unresolved pain shaped the way they connected, protected, or distanced themselves. What you experienced as neglect or criticism may have been their attempt to cope with emotions they didn't know how to manage. Their silence may have come from a lifetime of being told to suppress their feelings. Their anger may have come from growing up in environments where love was taught through pressure rather than tenderness. Understanding this doesn't erase the hurt, but it shifts how you interpret it. Instead of seeing your parents as deliberate sources of pain, you begin to see them as people who never received the emotional tools required to give you what you needed. Their unhealed wounds influenced how they interpreted your behavior, how they disciplined you, and how they responded when you were vulnerable. A parent who was never allowed to show weakness might struggle to comfort you when you are hurting. A parent who grew up feeling invisible may have tried to control everything because control felt safer than chaos. A parent who never experienced unconditional love may not have known how to offer it, even if they deeply wanted to. This awareness doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it creates a space within you that is less burdened by resentment. It allows you to understand that your pain was often a continuation of theirs, passed down not out of cruelty, but out of emotional inheritance. When you see your parents through the lens of their own struggles, you detach from the belief that you were the cause of their reactions. You stop internalizing their limitations as something you deserved. You begin to recognize that they were surviving with the tools they had, even if those tools were inadequate. Recognizing their unhealed wounds gives you the clarity to break the cycle. You begin to respond to life with awareness instead of repeating the same patterns. You learn to offer yourself the emotional care they could not give. And in doing so, you reclaim the power to create a different future, one rooted in understanding, compassion, and healing, rather than the echoes of the past. Waiting for an apology keeps you emotionally stuck because it ties your healing to someone else's awareness, willingness, and emotional maturity. When you attach your freedom to the hope that another person will acknowledge the pain they caused, you place your life on pause. You hold your breath, waiting for words that may never come, and in doing so, you allow the past to continue dictating your present. An apology feels like closure, like validation, like a final confirmation that what you experienced mattered. But relying on it means giving someone else the power to decide when you can move forward. Emotional wounds linger not only because of what happened, but because you keep waiting for the person who hurt you to undo the damage with an admission of guilt. People often cannot apologize because doing so would require them to confront their own unresolved wounds, their own shame, or their own limitations. Some parents cannot say "I'm sorry" because they were never allowed to admit mistakes when they were children themselves. Some cannot face the pain they caused because it triggers their own history of hurt. Some resist apologizing because it unravels the identity they built to survive. Their inability to apologize is not proof that your pain is invalid. It is a reflection of their emotional constraints. When you wait for an apology, you remain emotionally bonded to the moment you were hurt. You replay conversations in your mind, imagining what they should have said, rehearsing how you would respond if they finally understood. You revisit the same emotional landscape, hoping for a different ending. But healing rarely arrives through someone else's awakening. It arrives when you decide that your peace matters more than their acknowledgement. Letting go of the need for an apology is not about denying your feelings. It is about releasing yourself from the emotional cage that waiting creates. It means recognizing that closure is something you give yourself, not something someone else grants. It means understanding that the person who wounded you may never develop the insight required to see the situation through your eyes, and that is their limitation, not your responsibility. When you stop waiting, you reclaim your power. You stop expecting the past to rewrite itself. You stop depending on others to validate your pain. You allow yourself to heal even if the person who hurt you remains unchanged. And in that moment you step into a new form of freedom, one that is not tied to anyone else's apology but rooted entirely in your decision to move forward. Seeing your parents as imperfect human beings, not mythical figures, reduces the weight of their mistakes because it allows you to shift from the child's perspective to an adult's understanding. As children, we naturally place our parents on emotional pedestals. We see them as protectors, providers, and all-knowing figures who are supposed to have every answer and solve every problem. This idealization creates an unconscious expectation that they will act flawlessly, love perfectly, and never disappoint us. When they inevitably fail to meet those expectations, as all humans do, the disappointment cuts deeper than it should. The hurt feels personal, the mistakes feel intentional, and the wounds feel defining. But when you begin to see your parents through the lens of adulthood, something starts to unravel. You notice the limitations they carried, the pressures they endured, and the fears that shaped their decisions. You begin to understand that they were navigating life with their own emotional gaps, their own insecurities, and their own unhealed trauma. They weren't superheroes with limitless strength. They were individuals trying to survive, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, and often doing the best they could with the tools they had. This shift does not erase the pain they caused, but it allows you to see their actions within a broader context. When you release the expectation of perfection, you stop assigning moral weight to every mistake they made. Instead of seeing their failures as deliberate betrayals, you begin to see them as human errors. Their inability to communicate, their moments of anger, their emotional distance, or their lack of guidance become less about your inadequacy and more about their humanity. You no longer take their imperfections as evidence of your unworthiness. You begin to understand that their shortcomings were not reflections of your value, but reflections of their struggles. This perspective offers emotional relief. The heavy resentment, the long-held anger, and the sense of being wronged start to soften because you realize that the person who hurt you was also hurting in ways you may never fully know. It becomes easier to accept that they could not give what they never received themselves. Their limitations become comprehensible rather than unforgivable. Seeing your parents as human doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or forgetting the impact it had on you. It simply means acknowledging that they, like everyone else, were shaped by their own battles. And when you embrace this truth, you free yourself from the burden of expecting perfection from people who were never capable of it. You lighten the emotional weight you've carried and create space within yourself for understanding, healing, and a more grounded sense of peace. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting, it means remembering without carrying the emotional burden. Forgetting would imply erasing the memory, pretending the experience never happened, or dismissing the impact it had on your life. But the past cannot simply be deleted. The experiences that shaped you, especially the painful ones, often carve deep marks in your emotional landscape. Forgiveness is not about wiping those impressions clean. It is about learning to hold them with a different kind of energy. When you forgive, the memory remains, but the sting that once accompanied it begins to fade. The emotional charge dissolves, and what once triggered pain starts to evoke understanding, clarity, and even gratitude for the growth that emerged. Remembering without pain is a form of liberation. It means the memory no longer controls your reactions or your identity. You can recall what happened without your body tightening, your heart sinking, or your mind spiraling into old narratives. Instead of reliving the event, you observe it with the calm awareness that comes from healing. You recognize how far you've come and how much strength you've gained from surviving and processing the moment. The memory becomes a chapter, not a prison. Forgiveness transforms the meaning of the past. It allows you to reinterpret the experience from the perspective of who you are now, rather than who you were when it happened. When you stop carrying the emotional burden, you stop dragging old pain into new relationships. You stop making decisions out of fear or resentment. You stop seeing yourself through the lens of what someone else did to you. The past loses its power to define your future. What remains is wisdom, an understanding of the patterns, lessons, and boundaries that will guide you toward healthier choices. Letting go of the emotional weight does not require reconciliation or forgetting the hurt. It does not require pretending the person who caused the pain has changed. It simply requires an internal shift, the willingness to stop suffering from something that is no longer happening. It's the conscious choice to release yourself from the emotional bonds that tie you to a moment long gone. When you're able to remember without hurting, you reclaim your authority over your own story. You allow yourself to move through life with lightness rather than heaviness. The memory remains as part of your history, but the pain no longer owns your heart. That freedom is the true essence of forgiveness. You are responsible for breaking the generational cycle because you are the one who has become aware enough to see the patterns clearly. Awareness is the turning point, the moment you recognize that the emotional wounds passed down through your family are not random but inherited. What you experienced was often an echo of what your parents experienced and what their parents experienced before them. Without conscious intervention, these patterns repeat automatically, shaping the ways families communicate, love, argue, distance, and protect themselves. When you realize this, you stand at the crossroads where history can either continue or change. That awareness gives you a responsibility not of blame, but of choice. Breaking the cycle means becoming the person who refuses to pass down the same pain you were given. It means choosing emotional honesty over silence, compassion over defensiveness, and self-reflection over reaction. You begin to question the beliefs and behaviors that were normalized in your home. You examine the wounds that influenced the way you formed relationships, handled conflict, or saw yourself. You start to understand that the discomfort you feel when you challenge old patterns is actually the birth of something new, something healthier, clearer, and more intentional. This responsibility is not about fixing your parents or healing their wounds for them. It is about healing what lives inside you so the next version of your life, your relationships, your future children, or even just the inner world you inhabit, does not carry the same weight. You take on the emotional work they were unable or unwilling to do. You develop tools they never had: therapy, communication skills, emotional awareness, boundaries, and the courage to name what was once unspoken. With each step you take toward healing, you create a small rupture in the generational chain, and that rupture becomes an opening for transformation. Being responsible for breaking the cycle does not mean you must be perfect. It simply means you are committed to doing differently. You learn to respond rather than react. You practice forgiveness, not to forget the past, but to release its grip on your present. You understand that healing is not instant. It is a slow, intentional process of unlearning and rebuilding. When you step into this responsibility, you become the bridge between what was and what can be. You honor your own pain by refusing to repeat it. And in doing so, you become the first chapter of a new story, one defined not by the wounds of your lineage, but by the healing you chose to create. And so, as you stand here now, holding the weight of the past in one hand and the possibility of a different future in the other, remember this: you are not defined by what you inherited. You are defined by what you choose to do with it. The pain you carried was never meant to be a lifelong burden. It was meant to awaken you to the parts of yourself that needed compassion, strength, and understanding. You are not healing for your parents, and you are not healing to rewrite the past. You are healing because your heart deserves peace, your mind deserves clarity, and your life deserves freedom. Forgiving your parents is not about changing them. It is about freeing yourself. It is about stepping out of the shadow of old wounds and into a life where you no longer react from fear, from defensiveness, or from childhood echoes. It is choosing to live with an open heart, not a guarded one. It is choosing to grow where generations before you stayed stuck. It is choosing to be the one who ends what has harmed your family line for so long. You are the interruption. You are the transformation. You are the healing your story has been waiting for. And when you finally release the past from your hands, you make room for a life that feels lighter, fuller, and truly your own.